have friends, some of my closest friends are extroverts. I have friends who are introverts, but I also have friends who are extroverts. And for my brother, for example, who I'm very close with whom I'm very close, he's an extrovert. Like, we're two opposite ends of the spectrum, and we're always taking jabs at each other because of it. We're the type where we'll go vacationing together, and he's the type we'll get on the tour bus and he introduces himself to everybody on the bus. And I'm sitting in the corner like, nobody cares, man. Sit your ass down. Like, why are you? I'm not getting up to introduce myself. That's for sure. But that's how different we are. And so, even a good friend of mine in Toronto, Eva, quality time for her and a good time for her is spending time with all of us and pre-drinking at her house and then going to party for 4 hours in downtown Toronto. And for me, that's a nightmare. I love her to death, but the granny in me needs to take a nap right before I hang out with her because I just can't handle it. It's just too much. I legit need to take a nap, and then I show up to all her parties late because the introvert in me is like, this is not rejuvenating. This takes energy out of me. Yeah, so the journey, to go back to your question after that long-winded story, for me, it's about finding out, okay, what's going to rejuvenate me, whether or not I'm with people I care about or I'm alone. What am I going to do that's actually going to help me recoup and feel refreshed? And that's been a challenge because binge watching something on Netflix for me it doesn't do it for me. It's restful to a point, but to come out at the other end feeling re-energized, that's something completely different for me. And that's, I think, a little bit harder. It takes a bit more purposefulness, a bit more thought, and a bit more intentionality to and I think sometimes to really discover what that looks like. So the the example that comes to mind readily for me is there was one day I think it was close to when I right after I'd moved to Ottawa actually, and it was in the fall maybe, and my day was beautiful sunny day, but a bit on the cooler side, and I went to mass at 11, had a great lunch because I love food, had a really good lunch, and then walked around in I think it was Vanier because they had a local artist like open house or something. So I was going to different houses and different art galleries and just looking at local work. And then I had a call with my family at the end of the day. And for me, that was rejuvenating. It was a combination of different things. And I did a lot of walking as well. So all of those things I found at the end of that was rejuvenating for me. But if I had to say, okay, outside of that experience, what else is going to be rejuvenating when I'm just by myself as an introvert and trying to refresh and just hit reset? That's a hard question to answer. Like, I'm still discovering what that actually looks like. And I find I don't know if it's necessarily a challenge just for introverts. I think it might be a challenge for everybody who works in the knowledge economy, who is working long hours and in those jobs where work is not just your 9 to 5, but it's part of your working overtime, or it's in your thoughts and in your mind and occupying your sleep and your dreams. And it's just constantly part of your day to day. And you don't even have time to figure out what you want and who you are because you're just about your work. Again, it comes down to sort of workload and how a lot of organizations structure work, is that if I don't actively take time to take a step back and to think so I can process information, it becomes overwhelming, and I find I'm not as productive as I need to be. or I'm not getting the things done that are most important to me. So, and some of it is about the environment, some of it is about intentionality. When I worked at Mars, we had lots of meeting rooms available, so I could just walk away from my desk and my phone and just grab my laptop and not answer emails for 2 hours and just sit in a room with a whiteboard and put some music on and just think and write and figure stuff out. In the environment I'm in now, when we were in our physical space pre-pandemic, I didn't really have that luxury. We had meeting rooms that you can't really, because they're a high commodity. It's a hot commodity. You can't really book a space and say you're just going in there by yourself. And then there's no real other space where you can just sort of hide out for 2 hours. It's also very meeting heavy, that environment, so it's also hard to kind of disappear. Which means I have to be very intentional now with the opportunity to work from home, to just carve out space and time for myself where I can do some thinking. Yeah, and I think there's the introversion piece, but I also think it's made it's made more difficult by the elements of imposter syndrome that I'm working through, because that adds another layer to it, where I might be in a meeting and I'm like, why, how did I get here? What am I doing here? Like, am I even qualified to be sitting at this table and having this conversation? And so it's not just the needing to process information, take time, but it's also having to parse through that I not an identity crisis, but that lie that my mind is telling me that, oh my gosh, everybody else is qualified and you aren't, and everybody else is adding value, but this is not where you should be. So I have to work through both those things, and I think the imposter syndrome is priority for me, so that I can be more vocal and I can recognize that there's a reason I'm at this table. I've been invited to have a seat at the table and to contribute and to add value because I can, because because I've earned that right. Um, and then to just own that I need space and I need time to be able to think and to be able to process information. And I think, to an earlier conversation that we had, I think a week, 2 weeks ago, to sometimes be okay with something being half baked and to not come into a meeting with like an end-to-end solution for something that they just wanted 2 bullet points on. So, and I had that experience today in a kickoff meeting for a project plan, and I've been sitting in front of this spreadsheet for at least a week now, just looking at it thinking, oh my gosh, we have this kickoff meeting, I don't feel ready, I don't even know what we're doing yet, I don't have all the information. And just to be willing to take a step back and say, well, okay, that's fine, we'll figure it out when we get there. Maybe I don't have to have it figured out. And yeah, it was okay. So I think one of the things I've learned over the last few weeks, in particular, is the value of being willing to not have things all figured out and not have things perfect, and um, the value of, well, the importance of valuing my own voice in the process and who I am in the process. And I think that makes for, in a work environment, that certainly makes for a more productive employee, a more confident employee, a happier employee, just generally speaking. Um, and it probably, chances are that the byproduct of that is that you've got just a more effective workplace, because people feel confident in who they are and people feel confident in what they're bringing to the table. I'm having to be more, not so much flex my style, but I'm having to be more sociable than I probably would be under normal circumstances, just because I need to check in on my team. So I recommended, for example, to or VP to the VP for my business unit that we book calls with the team, the entire team, the entire business unit, um, just to make sure everybody was okay periodically. Now, I'm 100% fine with, you know, just I'm fine. But I recognize that when you have junior employees, they need to know that you care about them. Um, we have to, people are experiencing COVID-19 in so many different ways that it's also just important to make sure that people are healthy and people are safe. And then, so there is that, but one of my direct reports also booked daily coffees, 9 a.m. coffees. Optional, but it's just for internal team. And for me, she booked it for every day, and I looked at that and I was like, at 9 o'clock, I'm a bear before I have my coffee. The last thing I want to do is to be all smiles with anybody at 9 a.m. I am barely functional. But this is what my team needs. So I'm stretching myself in this way. So it's more from that perspective. What's also a bit of a stretch, interestingly, even though I am an introvert, is how to navigate how the introverts on my team are handling their workload, and based on that introversion. Because a lot of, I have folks on my team who it's easy for them to not just sort of cut themselves off from the rest of the team, but who it's very easy for them to just hunker down in the work and get tied up in the weeds and lost in the work and potentially burn themselves out. So it's easy for me to perceive that, but it's not necessarily easy for me to manage that. And so that's been the blessing of introversion, is being able to perceive that. But the challenge is that I have to figure out, okay, they're not in office physically, they're just at home. I can't see how they're managing their time and if they are burning themselves out. So how do I address this? So it's been interesting, and I've had to find some, I guess, more creative ways to get them to talk through how they're managing their time or how they're managing their resources, and to work through that, as opposed to if they were physically in office where I could see what's happening more easily.
It actually sounds like, the part that you relate to well is because it connects, is the piece that connects back to your own story. You said 4 or 5 years ago, part of your journey started with the burnout, and you recognized that it probably was you probably doing the same thing. You so immersed into whatever it was that you were in, so connected to that, and you forget that there's so many other pieces. So I think you're so uniquely positioned in having journeyed that, and also the fact that your journey includes the depression piece that came with it. You understand it in a way. So I agree with you. You have that level of perceiving it, and now it's like, okay, how do I now address this? And I think that's a really important piece, because especially for a lot of organizations right now, this idea of mental health it's been around. Like, obviously that conversation has been pretty high over the past several years, but in this current situation, because it's something none of us has really navigated before, it's showing up so much more in like full force. So I definitely can see where that question comes in, is how do I now start to engage and uncover these things with my team? It's interesting. I was talking to somebody and they said that one of the things that the VP of their team had encouraged them to do is, he said, when you're meeting with your team, show up as you as the person and not you as the title. So Nancy, the human being, as opposed to Nancy, the team leader, and talk in that way. So that meant actually sharing, not just finding out how everybody else is doing, but also letting them know how you're doing. And that means inclusive of, this is where I'm not doing well.
Right, right, right.
And
Mm,
so the leaders some leaders were not, like, some are just naturally, it was coming so naturally for them to be that way. And for others, it was a little bit more of like, how do I do that? How do I separate? And I feel like I have to separate my human being from my title.
yeah.
And what's needed more during this time is that human being. And for me, the story you started with at the very beginning of our conversation really connects with me, because even though I may not have suffered with depression, like, knowing that that's been your journey humanizes that component for me to say, she'll get it.
Yeah,
She'll get
yeah,
that I'm not doing well. It may not be
yeah.
depression, but I'm not doing well right now. And I find that that advice that he gave was actually very poignant. And it's something that we
Mm,
all can take on to say, how do we show up in a way that just show up as who you are? Not as in, I have to
yeah.
have an answer for whatever problem you have, or we're going to solve it. We may not solve it, but I can be present right now for, so you know, I'm not doing well. This week
Mm-hmm.
has not been a good week for me, and here's why it's not been a good week. I've just, whether it's like, haven't mentally haven't been feeling well, or the family, this is what's happening, and I just haven't been doing well. And what they found is, on those teams, there's a different kind of engagement that's rising. There's a different kind of
Wow.
trust. And it's not like all the problems are going away. It's just there's something else that's being created that's making people feel safe,
Yeah.
that I have a place to go. I have someone who understands. And I think that's a real valuable lesson. And I think that goes for, and that has nothing to do with introversion, extroversion. I just feel like that's a human quality that we can all display. That where introverts have the strength is exactly what you said. We already have that perception part of, like, perceiving, like, you probably can
Yes.
pick up on it already, that something may not be right here.
Yeah.
I think the next step would be, like, how do I show up maybe in a way that opens up a room? And again, it goes back to what you said. It's not about having the answers. It may not even solve anything, but it brings
Mm-hmm.
a human component to things, where people just feel safe, and they feel like, oh, like, yeah, I feel okay to talk about this, and I can actually bring this up. And what gets created on your team then is something far beyond deliverables. It's something much, much greater than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how I just kind of, when I heard that, I was like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense.
That's really powerful, because I find it's it's not easy to create that balance of showing up, to find that balance, or to even show up just as that person versus as a manager. And I'm thinking of, even how I try to balance that. It's not always easy, because, to your point, I'm constantly I'm constantly wearing the hat of, okay, I'm a manager, therefore if they come to me with a problem, what's my solution for it, or what's my answer for it? And I think there's always a question in my mind too of, well, not so much the question, but the thinking in my mind of, this is my responsibility to my team. How do I lead with that responsibility in mind? I am responsible for these people, or feel a sense of responsibility to them, and so how do I navigate that in a yeah how do I navigate that, and is it always, is it showing up as that human that human that sounds yeah, that sounded a bit strange. Is it showing up as Gina the human, or is it showing up as um, Gina the manager? And it's, to your point, there's a lot of overlap and interconnection between both, and maybe they don't even need to be separate. It's probably more powerful, especially now that they're not separate. But I don't know that that's an easy distinction, or an easy balance for people to find.
Definitely, it's not easy. And I think it's because a lot of times we've grown up with this idea that these are, you separate these things. And even the fact,
Yeah.
like, when you were saying Gina the human versus Gina the manager, like, is that two separate things? Like, is that just not the same you would think that that's the same person.
Yeah.
But the value of, even if you think about the people who showed up in a way in your own life, you can think about the people who were actually who they were at all times. And I don't mean this as in, I love what you said about, you know how to flex. You're like, I know how to flex myself to adjust, and we all adjust, and it makes sense because we're dealing with different people who are not exactly like us. So of course you got to do some adjusting so that we all can work towards a common goal. But aside from that adjusting, that idea of compartmentalizing and showing up like I need to be this way all the time, or I have to solve the problem, and not all of, for example, your touch points every day don't have to be problem solving touch points. Like they're meant to be touch points, right? So it's like, I'd be, Gina the bear has shown up on this call.
Yeah.
Listen, people, I've just been having one of those days.
It might not go down well with HR, but it is what it is.
The bear has arrived. But I mean, this idea of being able to demonstrate that, I guess the main thing is, the challenge we always talk about in workplaces is people feel this disconnect all the time. And we spend the majority of our waking moments with our coworkers, in our work, in our business, not with our family. And so if that is the case, then for me, I'm like, wouldn't it make sense that you actually know who I am? Because the longer I have to keep being somebody else, at some point I'm going to crack, and you're going to be like, who the heck is this person that's just shown up here?
It's so true. Yes.
And again, it's not that adjusting piece. It's just this idea of being able to demonstrate that I too, like where I am right now, especially, and I think I've shared this with a few people. I said, this is a very unique time because in a way, none of us knows how to work through this. We're all figuring it out. Some of us are better at this side of it. Some of us are better at this side, but we're all figuring it out. So because we're in that position, there's so much more understanding from people when you say, I don't know, and I am actually dealing with this as well. And I think that's where I agree with you. It's not an easy thing for leaders to do. I feel that it's such an opportune thing to really separate who you are and also create something that is pretty amazing, like within your team, like something that like I said, transcends the business itself. It's something much greater than that. I feel that's the opportunity that we all have in front of us.
Absolutely. Yeah.